Welcome back to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. Let's start with a question. Have you ever wondered how you would have turned out if you had been stranded on a desert island since birth? Cut off from all social and cultural contact, how many of your current beliefs would you have developed for yourself? Left to your own devices with no outside influences at all, might your beliefs have turned out to be very different from what they are now? You might think that without the help of other people, you probably wouldn't have got very far at all in working things out for yourself. But another possibility is that without the hindrance of other people and the pressures and influences of society, you may have been able to exploit your potential to its fullest and end up working out things that could not have been discovered otherwise. This is the idea at the heart of a brilliant work of Islamic philosophy that we'll be looking at in this segment. The book is called Hayy bin Yaqzan, which is the name of the central character who is forced to grow up alone on a desert island. The character's name means the living son of the wakeful. Over the course of the story, Hayy makes a large number of discoveries using his own natural abilities. And most interestingly for us is that Hayy not only manages to attain knowledge of God all by himself, but also a path to God that relatively few religious people take. We'll see more about how Hayy does this shortly, when we go into the story in more detail. Before that, a quick word about the origin of the story is in order. The author of the book is Ibn Tufayl, and not much is known about his life, though we do know that he lived in the 12th century, and he was a philosopher and physician. Although he wrote a number of books, the only one to survive is Hayy bin Yaqzan, which he wrote in his 60s. We also know that Ibn Tufayl was a Sufi master. Sufism is the mystical strand of Islam that strives to get closer to Allah through contemplation and self-purification. And Ibn Tufayl's adherence to Sufism comes through in the book, as we'll see. So let's now turn to the book and work through the key parts of the story. The story begins on an uninhabited island off the coast of India, which is where Hayy will grow up and live for most of his life. And we're given two very different accounts of Hayy's origins. First, we're told that on a nearby, much bigger island, the sister of the king gave birth to Hayy, but fearing the king would disapprove, she put the child in a chest and released it into the sea. And the chest eventually washed up on the smaller, uninhabited island, resting in a thicket. Hearing the baby's cries, a female deer came over to the chest, broke it open with her hooves, and suckled the baby. In the second account of Hayy's origins, we're told that on the uninhabited island, the conditions are just right for the earth to give birth to human beings through natural processes alone, without need for a father or mother. In other words, by spontaneous generation. However Hayy comes about, he's cared for by a female deer who provides for his needs, for his food, his shelter and his warmth, all throughout his early years. Now, Hayy's life is marked out into 7 different stages, each of which lasts 7 years. In the first stage, which lasts up to the age of 7, Hayy develops basic problem-solving skills, which he puts to use for his safety and survival. He learns to forage for fruits, and after realizing that other animals have the natural means to defend themselves while he doesn't, he starts to use a stick to defend himself against animal attacks. In the second stage of life, Hayy has to contend with the death of the female deer that raised him. In the hope he can return the deer back to her original condition, he dissects her body. Eventually he finds an empty chamber in her heart, and he surmises that something had inhabited it while she was alive, and its departure was what killed her. He then becomes intrigued by this thing whose departure had ended the deer's life, figuring that the other deer must have it as well. One day, in the third stage of his life, Hayy comes across a fire and is fascinated by it. In an effort to keep it going, he throws in a fish. He likes the smell it produces and so decides to eat it, and that's his first taste of cooked meat. He also deduces that whatever it was that animated the deer, it must be like fire, because when she was alive, her body had a warmth that disappeared after she died. And the warmth in his own chest convinces Hayy that he has the same thing inside himself, giving his body life. When he cuts open a live animal and notices a hot vapour escaping from the heart, he concludes that this is what keeps animals alive, the animal spirit. In the third stage of life, which lasts until Hayy is 21, he conducts further experiments on animals to understand how their bodies work. He builds a house after watching swallows build a nest, and he learns how to tame animals so that he's able to use them to make him a more successful hunter. In the fourth stage of his life, Hayy makes further investigations into the various physical things on the island, so plants, rocks, water, soil, and so on. In figuring out the ways in which they're similar and the ways in which they differ, Hayy tries to work out the essence of each thing. In his own case, he decides that his essence is the animal spirit, which makes him a unified being rather than just a collection of disparate parts. He reaches the same conclusion about other living things, and then he starts to see the animal spirit of the members of a particular species as essentially one spirit that happens to be divided among many individual animals, like a single quantity of water divided into several bottles. Further experiments suggest to Hayy that all physical things are composed of two factors. First, there's matter, which simply involves being three-dimensional, having length, width, and depth. And then there's form, which is what gives a thing its distinguishing characteristics and a disposition to have certain functions or behaviours. When something loses its form, a new form is acquired, and there will be a different set of distinguishing characteristics and different dispositions. So, for example, when a plant is burned, the matter continues to exist, but changes its form. It loses the form of the plant and acquires the forms of ash and smoke. But Hayy realizes that forms don't have the power to bring themselves into existence when a change like this occurs. Or indeed, they don't have the power to change themselves in any situation at all. So he concludes that there must be a power or agent behind them, one that cannot be seen but can only be inferred from the changes that occur in the natural world. In the fifth stage of his life, Hayy turns his attention to the heavens, observing the path of the moon and the path of the planets, and he surmises that they're all interconnected in the same way that the various things of his island have parts that were interconnected to form individual animals, individual plants, and so on. He therefore decides to treat the heavens as a single thing, and supposes that it too requires an agent. And this leads him to an initial formulation of the idea of God as the agent behind the universe. And he deduces that God must have power and knowledge, but not be a body. Now convinced that everything in the universe is the result of God, Hayy gets a newfound appreciation for the things he's already studied, seeing them with fresh eyes as God's handiwork. Further reflection reveals to Hayy that God must be devoid of any imperfection, and so must be good and merciful, as well as powerful and wise. Now it's important to note here that Hayy is not so much a believer in God's existence as a knower of God's existence. And this is a triumph of Hayy's rational method. In the story, he has succeeded in reaching a much greater degree of certainty than those who simply believe in God because of what others tell them, or because of what a particular sacred text says. And one could read the story as simply highlighting the power of human reason when used correctly. and many have read it in exactly that way. But this is not in fact the moral that Ibn Tufayl wants us to draw. The moral of the book becomes clear only in the next stages of Hayy's life. So let's turn now to the 6th and 7th stages, which run from the age of 36 to the age of 50. At the start of this period, Hayy has determined that his own essence has something in common with that of God. Both are non-physical. As corruption and destruction apply only to physical things, Hayy concludes that neither God nor his own essence, his soul, can be corrupted or destroyed. And this raises the question of what happens to Hayy's soul when his body dies. He reasons that if he dies in contemplation of God, then his soul will achieve eternal bliss. But if he turns away from God, he will spend eternity in agony, longing for God but deprived of God. So Hayy commits himself to contemplating God as much as is humanly possible, and he draws up guidelines for living to facilitate this. Whenever possible, he reflects attentively upon God, and he employs spiritual exercises like spinning in a circle to help focus his mind and block out the senses and imagination, which might otherwise get in the way. Over time, Hayy trains himself to be able to focus upon God for days at a time, and eventually he succeeds in achieving a mystical union with God, which cannot be put into words, although the book's author, Ibn Tufayl, really does try. Soon in the story, Hayy is able to achieve union with God at will. In these episodes, his essence becomes absorbed into God's essence, and he longs for death so that his union with God may become permanent. And we may take Hayy's ability to achieve mystical union with God as the key point of the story. His discovery of God through reason, as impressive as it might be in its own right, is merely a necessary step to the mystical experiences, which are the real prize. It's worth noting here that in Hayy's first 7 stages of life, he progresses or ascends from one form of learning to another. He starts with logic, then moves on to the natural sciences, and then finally to metaphysics. And this is no accident. The order in which Hayy attains his knowledge reflects the hierarchical structure of knowledge identified by an earlier Islamic thinker called Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi argued that logic is the tool necessary for the study of anything else, so humans should begin their learning with that, before moving up the scale of difficulty to the natural sciences and then finally to metaphysics. And Hayy does all this, but he then ascends even further, taking a step that Al-Farabi had not considered, which is that Hayy's theoretical reflection ultimately opens the door to a rapturous experience of God and an absorption into God. And by training and self-discipline, Hayy is able to sharpen his mystical skills, so to speak, and attain oneness with God almost at will. So for him, reason is simply a stepping stone to the ultimate goal of attaining oneness with God. This experience is made possible by reason, but in itself it transcends reason. So on account of this, we may perhaps describe Hay's intellectual and spiritual journey as rational mysticism. This might make us wonder, what is Ibn Tufayl trying to tell us with the story of Hayy? Well, to me, the book doesn't come across as a manual for spiritual enlightenment. Most of the story would be simply irrelevant if that were the aim. Instead, the story seems to suggest what is possible for human beings if their talents and resources are allowed to develop to their maximum potential. And in this we can see something of a parallel with the way that the book starts, with the suggestion that Hayy may have been spontaneously generated by the earth. In presenting this idea, Ibn Tufayl presumably doesn't want us to take it literally, but it could be construed as a metaphor of sorts. So just as the earth, given optimum conditions, may draw on its latent powers and do something extraordinary, namely produce a human being, which is the highest form of living thing, so human beings, if given optimum conditions, may draw upon their latent powers and do something extraordinary, namely attain a near permanent union with God in this life. If we push the metaphor a bit further, we could say that just as the optimum conditions for the spontaneous generation of humans never actually obtain, so the optimum conditions for a near permanent union with God never actually obtain either. But even though there never has been or will be a true Hayy bin Yaqzan, he still represents an ideal towards which we should strive. We might not be able to achieve what Hayy did, but if we take the right steps, we might at least go some of the way. And this, I take it, is what Ibn Tufayl wants to say to us. And this seems to fit with his own vision of Islam, which involves, as one scholar puts it, the progressive assimilation of oneself to God, so far as lies in human power. While Hayy's unaided progress from the simplest forms of knowledge to eventual mystical union with God is surely the principal subject of the book, there is in fact more to the story. The final part of the story covers what happens to Hayy when he turns 50. One day he suddenly finds that he's not alone on the island anymore. It turns out a man called Absol has travelled there from the nearby Big Island, desiring solitude in order to practice his religion. Absol encounters Hayy and teaches him language, which enables the two to exchange ideas. It becomes apparent that Hayy's God is the same as the one of Absol's religion, and we can assume that this is Islam. However, Hayy is puzzled about some of the features of Absol's religion. He can't understand why it sometimes uses corporeal images to depict God. Perhaps that's an allusion to God being described in the Quran as having hands and a face, as we saw in last week's topic. And Hayy also cannot understand why Absol's religion prescribes the rituals that it does, and why its laws concern the distribution of money. To Hayy, these things are trivial compared with what he has discovered. So Hayy decides he wants to meet with the inhabitants of the large island in order to teach them what he has discovered. So he travels there with Absol. But Hayy has overestimated the receptiveness of the other islanders. While they are prepared to listen to him, they aren't interested in what he has to say, preferring to stick with what they already believe. So Hayy finds them lacking in wisdom and more concerned with everyday matters than spiritual ones. So in the end, Absol and Hayy travel back to the island where Hayy grew up, and they live out their years in ecstatic contemplation of God. Now this last part of the book could be read as Ibn Tufayl suggesting that revealed religion is necessary for ordinary people, those who are not fortunate enough to have Hayy's great philosophical gifts, and the time and space to develop them in the way that he did. But that of course is virtually everyone. So revealed religion is useful, at least for the majority. It enables them to learn enough of what they need to learn to attain salvation. But clearly Ibn Tufayl thinks that Hayy's path to mysticism is the better one for those able to take it. I won't say any more about that now. By way of wrapping things up though, there is one other matter that deserves comment. Earlier this year I asked a philosopher in Iran how Ibn Tufayl's book was perceived in the Muslim world. He told me it was neglected. Islamic philosophers today focus instead on other thinkers from the classical period of Islam. To understand why, we need only to consider that the beliefs and practices that Hayy is said to discover all by himself do not correlate perfectly with the beliefs and practices of Muslims. Hayy does not pray 5 times a day, nor does he fast during Ramadan, nor does he seek to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. He also knows nothing about the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, at least until Absol comes to the island and tells him about them. So what Hayy discovers is not the Islam that most Muslims would recognize. At best, what Hayy discovers is consistent with Islam, but in itself is not distinctly Islamic. And that just makes me wonder, perhaps Hayy's discoveries are consistent with other religions as well, such as Judaism or Christianity. But that's a question that I will leave with you.